Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Sports Exchange. My name is Scott Morganroth, Motor City Madmouth, and yes, this is Motor City Night here in South Florida, which is where this broadcast is being recorded, visualized. You got it. So with that said, welcome George Eichorn back to the broadcast, my regular co-host. Good evening, George.
Good evening, Scott. Good to be here again on this Monday evening.
Yeah, here it is, old Monday, the night before election. Don't worry, our guest, Kurt David, that's as far as we're going. The election, we welcome Kurt David to the broadcast tonight. Kurt, nice to have you on.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you mentioned, no politics tonight, just sports and more sports.
Sounds like a plan to me. There are enough outlets for it, and I have no interest in politics or religion, and that's where we're going. The only political reference I'll have, it's the night before election, and that's it. All right, Mr. Eichorn.
Well, Kurt David is joining us, and Kurt, you've got a nice background, and why don't you tell us a little bit about your background, how you got started, and from Glory Days, your enterprise up here in Michigan, and fire away.
Yeah. Well, it's great. I appreciate the time here and being with you guys here. One of the things I always say is I cannot talk about what I do without talking about who I am, because those aren't always parallel, right? And who I am basically started with the foundation of 8 of us in one house. There was growing up with 8 of us in one house with one bathroom. So you learn early on in life that life is not all about you, right? And so that was my foundation. There was 8 of us, both parents, 6 kids. And the neat thing is all 6 of us were on athletic scholarship and 2 of us played professionally. So imagine that household growing up, extremely competitive, extremely, anything, brushing your teeth. That was a lot of Nerf hoop back and forth, but that was my foundation. And that really, and the reason why I bring that up now as part of the introduction is that was really who I was and how I started to get to where I am today. I mean, that was part of the journey. It's an important part of my journey as a result. And so from there on, moving on, I was able to play professional basketball, played overseas. And as a result, I've had experience as a professional athlete. But then as we know, with every professional athlete, 100% of professional athletes ultimately lose their job, right? It's an undeniable fact. And as a result, at some point I was done. And when I got done, I realized that there is life after pro sports. And even though I didn't like it, and we can go into much detail when we talk about that aspect of my life if you want. But, moving forward, I was able to transition. Fortunately, I had a degree. I went and got a master's degree as well after that. And eventually had an idea. And that idea was this. What would it be like if I were to sit down with other former professional athletes and hear about their life after pro sports, and more importantly, about how they recreated their success after pro sports? And that's what spawned the book From Glory Days. And so I sat down with 20 former Detroit Pistons, Tigers, Red Wings, and Lions and interviewed them about their life after pro sports, and namely how they recreated their success. Well, the book became a bigger deal than I expected. It became a regional bestseller, and my agent and I at the time said, boy, this is a bigger deal than a book. Let's create a TV show based on this book. And that was the motivation for the TV show. And we created 4 seasons, done 50 TV interviews, won an Emmy in season 4, and looking to scale it to a national level. And so it's been a great journey, and it only continues, and I can tell you all sorts of stories from there. But that's kind of a quasi introduction of where I am and how I got here.
All right, one of the things I look for in a guest, and I use LinkedIn a lot. Obviously, that's where you and I connected initially. But when I invite a guest on any of my broadcasts, when I look at professional athletes, I like to know what they've done after their careers, not so much what you did on the field. Mm-hmm. And if I find that they're as successful after they're playing dice, then I reach out to them, and I've been able to bring on a lot of good guests because of that philosophy. So I can appreciate where you're coming from.
Yeah, it's exciting because you think about it. If an athlete at any level, high school, college, professional, if they apply the wherewithal that got them to that level of athleticism back into the real world,
right,
staying back, that's pretty exciting. And it's neat to see when athletes do that, former athletes do that.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of which, have you, when you first started, obviously you focused more, like you said, on the Detroit athletes. Can you tell us some of the ones that you talked to initially? And you mentioned Pistons, Red Wings, Lions, Tigers, some of the guys that you've interviewed and had great stories on them.
Yeah, I was very fortunate to have local athletes. A lot of them stayed right around here, and that's the neat thing about Detroit. I mean, Detroit athletes tend to stay around here because they're pretty beloved around here, right? We're pretty good with our beloved athletes, the ones that we have done well for us, and we would like having them hang around. I purposely interviewed for the book gentlemen from different eras. In other words, I wanted to get some older guys as well as some more recent guys. So the oldest guy in the book is Joe Schmidt, who was from the Detroit Lions. And unfortunately, the last time the Detroit Lions won what would have been an equivalent of a Super Bowl, which, George, you probably know the answer to this question, and maybe Scott as well, right? That anybody know that 19, what was it?
57.
1957, exactly. That was
Scott has a special connection to that, right, Scott?
Yeah, you know what, Kurt? If it happened on December 29th, 1957, that was my birthday 5 years before I was born.
Oh, wow. Yeah, so it would have been probably just right before that, as a matter of fact. And so that was the last time our Lions had won what would have been equivalent to, it wasn't even called the Super Bowl at that time. It was called the NFL Championship.
Right.
But so, Joe Schmidt was one of the gentlemen I interviewed, and it was neat to hear him because he was an MVP of the NFL that year and won a couple different championships as a result. And he went on to coach as well after that. And then he went on to start a very successful manufacturing business after that as well. So he was the oldest guy in the book. I also interviewed Ted Lindsay, older statesman from the NHL and the Red Wings, obviously very beloved Hall of Famer there. The most recent would have been Allen Houston, who at that time was freshly out of the NBA. He had some issues with his knees, and he played with the Pistons, but then also finished up with the Knicks. Had the first $100 million contract. In fact, the NBA created some rules as a result of Allen's contract. But then the athletes in between. We mentioned about Johnny Ogrodnik off the air. We had talked about Johnny O. He was one of the 5-time All-Stars that he interviewed. Jim Northrup from the 1968 Tigers. That was a treat to be able to sit down with Jim and hear those stories. Very colorful man. Also sat down with Lem Barney, Hall of Famer, NFL Hall of Famer from the Detroit Lions. Dave Bing, who had great success, not just as a basketball player, but as a entrepreneur, went on to create a very big business here in Detroit afterwards, but then become mayor of Detroit. He continued to create a success over and over again. And so those are just some of the names of the 20 names that I interviewed for the book. And, what's neat about it too, is that most of the time I asked the same questions during the interviews. But the answers were always different, depending on their experience, depending on their journey. And that's what made it very interesting to me, was that each of their journeys to how they found success again was their own journey.
Yeah, and I would imagine, like you said before, that everybody's got their own story, their own journey. And certainly, Joe Schmidt, I've met Joe many times, and what a great guy he's been, a really true gentleman and a Hall of Famer. Ted Lindsay, the same way. John Ogrodnik, I have the privilege of knowing him too because of a connection with a former co-host of mine, Phil Guastella, and I became friends with Johnny O. And he's in the financial services area, if I'm not mistaken.
That is correct, yes.
And has he been successful there, I hope?
Well, he's taken some of my money, so I'd say so, yes.
That's good. Do you find, Kurt, that is it a wide variety of things that guys go into? I mean, the old days we always heard Mickey Lolich became a manufacturer's rep or Jim North manufacturer's rep. But what is the most common of a second occupation, if you will, for a lot of the athletes that you've talked to?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a great point that, it depends on the era of what I've discovered, because obviously the contracts today are very different than the contracts from, even 10, 15, 20 years ago.
Sure.
And so a lot of these gentlemen, when they played, for instance, Dan Petrie is one of the gentlemen I interviewed, and he talked about being retired at the age of 35 from professional baseball, right? After winning a World Series, he retired at the age of 35. And he talked about having to learn how to write a resume at the age of 35. And so a lot of these athletes from those eras, I'd say, from the 10, 15, 20 plus years ago, they all went into typically sales type jobs. Yeah. And the reason why is that a lot of times their doors were open simply because of their name. Right. I remember interviewing Dave Bergman, and Dave talked about how he only gave whoever he was meeting with 2 minutes to talk baseball. He says, I always got in the door. It was never a problem. I always got in the door. He says, but I only gave him 2 minutes to talk baseball because then I wanted to close. I want to, make a deal here. And so, but a lot of them went into sales simply because of that, their name recognition, whether it be as a manufacturing rep, as a financial advisor, some type of rep or salesman, because it really proved natural for them to be able to get the doors open. Some of them today, I think the athletes a little bit, if you look within the last 5 years, a lot of them that retire actually become entrepreneurs and businessmen because they have the capital to continue to move on,
Sure.
to get into that, and actually have teams of people. In fact, it's interesting because I've connected recently with a guy by the name of Paul Gasol, who won some championships in LA with the Lakers, and he's so focused now on life after sports as an entrepreneur. In other words, how do I build these businesses? I mean, Dave Bing's a great example of that, and he's an anomaly from that era. For a guy of that era to create, $400 or $500 million a year business that he did during that time, it was very unusual that he really took a route and learned a lot and continued to create a success. But yeah, I'd say, in answer to the question, a lot of them sales type positions for that reason.
I think
Sure.
one of the things that a lot of people try to avoid, and being a Rocky fan, and Rocky 2 is a prime example of what a lot of athletes go through, where Sylvester Stallone, you get a lot of money, but then you go broke pretty quick. And I know that there's probably lots of trends for which, while we're looking at successful entrepreneurs and all that kind of stuff, you also realize that there's that trend backwards as well, that you have it, like I said, in Rocky 2, Rocky Balboa, made a little bit of money, spent it on material goods, and then all of a sudden you're broke. And I imagine you probably deal with a lot of those types of trends, don't you?
Well, I'm so glad you asked that, because that's a very sober reality for professional athletes. And just to go over the stats, as I mentioned earlier, 100% of professional athletes ultimately lose their job. Undeniable fact, right? At some point they're done, whether it be by choice or not by choice. Most of the time it's not by choice. Very, very rarely will an athlete say, I'm done, I'm moving on, I'm going to let go, right? Very rarely it happens that way. Every once in a while. But most of the time it's like, hey, they're not good enough, or there's nobody signing them. The phone's not ringing anymore. So 100% are done at some point. 25% of NFL players are broke within the first year out.
Wow.
78% of NFL players within 2 years out. 60% of NBA players are broke within 5 years, and there's up to an 80% divorce rate. From job loss to disaster, that's the reality for transitioning professional athletes. And when I focus with athletes, I don't want to talk about the fact that you took a 95% pay cut, whether it be bankruptcy, whether it be divorces, whatever. That's the reality that they go through. However, we all know that's the trough, but then how did they get back up on that hill again? And, to go back a little bit, I always have people say, all these athletes are getting divorced and 8%. And I kind of chuckle, because the reality is this. Think about this. You go from being on the road 6 months out of the year to all of a sudden you're toe-to-toe with your spouse with a 95% pay cut. What kind of marriage is going to survive that, honestly?
That's true. Well, I mean, all the Rocky films, Rocky 2 was one I didn't particularly like a lot. And I'm not going to turn this into a documentary about the Rocky film. That's the one that came
If you want,
mind.
we can. I mean, go ahead.
Well, there's probably a lot like it, though. But when you think of guys like Latrell Sprewell, is there probably another one who falls in your category where, here's a guy, I can't feed my family off of this money he's being paid. But I know there's a lot of stories, Kurt, out there like that.
Sure. Well, in the biggest to me is Michael Tyson, right? $300 million. 300. Let that sink in for a second.
Yeah.
300 million. I mean, that's more than some countries' gross domestic product.
Yeah.
And it's gone, right? Gone. And like I tell people, it's not all Michael. He had people robbing him blind. He had the wrong people around him that were stealing his money. But, Michael made some choices too. Does he really need a white tiger or white tigers? You know what I'm saying? And so it was a combination of both for him. But, that's a really bad scenario to talk about loss of money. But, you hear about it with the lotto winners as well. It's quick wealth. The pro athletes have a very small window of opportunity to have their highest earning potential. In other words, 3.2 years is the average. And so I have 3.2 years to make the most amount of money I can make for the rest of my life, unless I become somebody like a Magic Johnson or a Michael Jordan, which is an anomaly, to make more money now than I ever did as an athlete,
right.
Which is rare, but it happens, right?
Yeah.
And so most of them, it's like, okay, now I got to go get a real job. I gave you a great example. One of the guys we interviewed from season 4 was a former Detroit Lion by the name of Corey Schlesinger. Corey was a national champion out of Nebraska, fullback with the Lions. And, he's now teaching. He's literally teaching drafting classes and architecture classes. That's what he's doing for a living. And so to go from being a professional athlete to a drafting teacher, right? And loving every minute of it.
Yeah, here's another name for you. And Scott and I, of course, knew this fella way back when, but Mel Farr Sr. Mel Farr Sr., to become that Ford dealer that he was and to open up multiple franchises of that Ford Motor Company showrooms. And we all know him as the Mel Farr, the superstar. And I know he's been on your show. Obviously, God rest his soul, he's gone now.
Yeah.
But Mel Farr Sr. was quite an entrepreneur.
I was very fortunate to get very close with Mel the last part of his life. And that's the neat thing about the book and the show. Most, if not all, the athletes that I've interviewed have become personal friends. Yeah. And so they love the concept. They love the idea of talking about, hey, let's talk about my glory days. Okay, let's talk about my bankruptcy or divorce or whatever. But then let's talk about what I'm doing now and how I created my success. And most athletes love that. But, Mel was a very special guy to me. And here's why. I was very fortunate to sit down with Mel, and I we all knew from the ads what was going on, that, the Mel Farr, the superstar. There's things that I didn't know. And one of the things I didn't know was the fact that he had 19 dealerships at the pinnacle of his career. He had 19 dealerships, and he was the number one African-American businessman in the nation at that time. And so let that sink in for a little bit, right? He was the number one African-American businessman in the nation, 19 dealerships. And how it all started is that, those guys during that era, they were playing football, but then also working there in the offseason. It was just something normal. What's neat that him and Lombardi came in the same year, and it's I don't know if it was the last time or the first time that the NFL Offensive Player of the Year and NFL Defensive Player of the Year were on the same team. In other words, the Rookie of the Year, they were both Rookies of the Year, one for offense, one for defense on the same team, Mel Farr and Lombardi. And anyway, so Mel started working during the offseason at one of the local dealerships. And he started, after a couple of seasons, realized, hey, you know what, this is good, but these dealers are the ones that are making the money. And so partway into his football career, he approached the Fords, and he says, how do I get a hold of one of these dealerships? How do I become one of these dealers? And literally, Ford said, hey, we got one in arrears. I don't know if it was down in Taylor or somewhere downriver. They said, it's in arrears right now. If you want to take it over, it's yours. And Mel's like, yeah, sure, I'll take it. And then the rest is history. He built up to 19 dealerships at that point. But then he told me the rest of the story and what happened, which, some people know, maybe some people don't know. Mel talked about how his goal was to get everybody in a car, regardless of their credit, right? He wanted to help people get into cars that normally maybe couldn't get a loan or something. And so, he staked his reputation. He staked his business on it. And one of the things that he claims he created this, I don't know if that's factual or not, but he said he created a device that would not start a car if they didn't make their payment. So he says, I still had to protect my assets. And so he put these devices on these lower credit loans of people in their cars. And he said, it wouldn't start if they didn't pay their bill. Well, he said all of a sudden they started having all these people complaining that, hell, I'm on the highway and all of a sudden my car stops running. And it's, and he had all these class action suits against him. He said, even though it's under starter, it's not, it's just not going to start their car. And he said he spent over $5 million on attorney fees. He won all the cases. He says, all the cases he won, but he spent over $5 million on attorney fees. Ford at that time was like giving him such a hard time, like, hey, what's all this negative press and what's going on? And he said at that point, he finally got done. He said he used to start selling off one dealership after another till, I want to say his final one was sold off in 2009. But that was the reason why he had, went up to the 19 dealerships and then why he got out of it at that point.
Wow. Interesting.
So there's an athlete, I don't know if you've ever heard the name Richard Diana.
That name sounds really familiar. Yeah, tell me more.
Well, yeah, I'll be more than happy to. Back in the early 1980s, I was covering the Miami Dolphins. And he was an Ivy League running back that Don Shula decided to draft. At that time, the Dolphins were looking for runners. And Richard Diana, well, I think he played 1 year and retired. Said, I don't want to do this football thing anymore, and became a doctor. That's what he did. And I believe he's a surgeon. Another one, Myron Rolle. Remember him? There's another guy out of Florida State, Rhodes Scholar. But Richard Diana's an interesting story too. You know how you talk about a guy, and he was smart too. I mean, they get if you go to the Ivy League, you're not stupid, but really,
Right. Yeah, you got to have something to get in.
but the Dolphins drafted him. They thought he could be help their running game out. One or two, I think he was there for like a year or two. Don't know exactly, but it was a very short career. Got back into medicine. He's never looked back since. So if you ever look him up, you should look him up. He might be a guy you might want to approach at some point. Back in the 80s, he was a really interesting type. I've never met him, but I do know I was covering the Dolphins. My first pro team, believe it or not, covering a team in the National Football League was the Miami Dolphins, working with Don Shula. And I can tell you what a tough experience that was being a teenager. It was intimidating, but I learned a lot from Don Shula.
I would imagine you saw a lot of great players come through there at that time as well. But
Yeah.
you brought up a great point, was that, the education. What I found with all the athletes that I've interviewed is that the ones that had an education to fall back on, their transition was a little bit easier.
Right.
Because they had something to fall back on. Whether they used it or not exactly for that field, at least it gave them a foundation to say, okay, well, I at least have this degree. Maybe I can go in that field or not. But it was very important for sometimes it's a detriment, though. I'll give you a great example. I haven't interviewed him for the shows, but he reached out to me a couple of years ago. And there was a gentleman that played professional soccer for 10 years, right? His name's Greg Jenneke. He played at Michigan State. And he went on to play professional soccer for 10 years after that. And he called me up after he was done playing. He says, "Hey, I heard you're the guy to work with former professional athletes to help with the transition." And I'm like, "Okay, tell me more." So he told me his story and, how he played. He fortunately finished up his degree at Michigan State, went on to play professional soccer for 10 years. And now he was done and looking for a job. And he said it was actually a detriment for him to have been a professional athlete, because when he started applying for jobs, they're looking at him saying, "Where's your experience?" And he's like, "Well, I don't have any. I've been playing professional sports for 10 years. And they're like, "Well, we're looking for somebody with more experience." He's like, "Well, I've been playing professional sports for 10 years. And so guys his age already had 10 years worth of work experience, where he was coming out fresh, with no work experience and all this experience as a professional athlete. But it actually, for him, he found it, he had to start back on the bottom again, which was a kind of a rude awakening. And it is for a lot of these athletes. It's like all of a sudden, boy, I got to start. Here I went from the top back down. And I think Johnny O, you mentioned Johnny O a couple of times. Johnny O had a famous saying. He says, "Why is it that when I'm making all this money as a professional athlete, I don't have to pay for anything, but all of a sudden I'm done playing and I got to pay for everything, my meals, my cars, my suits," and so.
And also that's a good story you related to us, Kurt. Talk about the guys who stay in the sports, though. Of course, you got guys that are broadcasters, scouts, managers, coaches, front office personnel. Any idea about what the percentage is of guys that actually do stay in the sports? And do you think that's a good idea for them to stay if they love the sport or love what they're doing? I'm sure it is.
Yeah, and I think the biggest thing is there's not too many of those jobs, right? And so you look at the percentages, it's like, boy, there's only so many NBA broadcasting jobs in each city, right? I mean, literally, there's maybe one as a, and so one of the guys I interviewed in the book and the TV show, his name's Greg Kelser, and Greg we know from, his championship with Magic Johnson at Michigan State, national championship, and then he went on to play professional. Yeah, he went on to play professional basketball. And one of the neat things about Greg was that during his playing career, he was enamored with TV. He just loved it. Just something about it attracted him. And he started hanging out in Detroit with a guy by the name of Charlie Neal, who was broadcasting at that time. He told Charlie, he says, "Hey, anytime I'm in town, can I just come and hang out with you in the studio, just watch what you do and learn from you?" And as a result, he did that for years and learned a lot. And so now Greg is in his 35th year of, sports broadcasting as a result in the NBA. And, certainly it's a great way to stay involved with the sport. But as I mentioned, there's not too many of those jobs as a coach, as a broadcaster. Every once in a while they'll go into the executive side and the business side. Like the gentleman, I think it's Pelinka out there. He played at the University of Michigan, and now he's out there with the Lakers, having great success as an executive. But, it keeps him in the game. It keeps him involved in that way. And that might help with that transition. I mean, Iceman Gervin, George Gervin.
Right.
He's he's in the front office. He's doing stuff with the Spurs, and so he's still involved. Earl Cureton locally is doing community stuff with the Pistons, and so he's still involved in that capacity. So I think it does help to still be involved with the game, but like I said, there's not too many of those jobs, so the odds of getting one of those are pretty slim.
Well, let me
Yeah.
tell you this. You talked about Mel Farr Sr., but the one guy that stands out to me, a former car dealer that's done well for our front office. Ever heard of a guy by the name of John Elway?
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah.
John Elway's done well for himself. He got into car dealership business and all of a sudden got back in football. And I had an opportunity to see him in Super Bowl 33. That was the first Super Bowl I covered. And I'll never forget the question I did have a chance to go ahead and ask him that nobody did get around to doing. I said, John, isn't it ironic that things worked out as well as they did when you requested a trade from the Baltimore Colts to the Broncos? And, he gave me the biggest John Elway grin because he was glad to hear a question that was so different, because nobody talks about the fact that he was drafted by the Colts. He told Robert Irsay, don't draft me, I'm not going to play. And then Irsay was forced to ship him off to the Broncos, and we know how that turned out. And then John Elway became an icon in Denver. But yet the irony between John Elway and Mel Farr is they both worked as car dealers for sure. And
I wonder how many Elway had at his peak. If he still has them or if he sold them off as well.
and he's out of the business. I think.
Well,
I heard a story a long time ago when he was at one of his dealerships that somebody asked him to pick up the sales tax, and I don't know if he ever did or not. He made enough money, but I never heard of this. Never heard there. But John Elway. Now we talked about a lot of the major sports, but one thing that enters my mind is: do you ever run across athletes from like NASCAR, auto racing, and other ones, or you just focus on the four major ones?
No, actually, we're expanding more and more. I'm a father of daughters, and so I'm always looking for women as well in women's sports and professional sports of different types. So, like one of the people we interviewed in season 3 was a former Russian Olympic gold medalist by the name of Tatiana Gutsu. And Tatiana was in I think it was in early 90s when she won a gold medal, silver medal, and she represented Russia at that time. She's actually from Ukraine. But, we try to be as diverse as possible with different sports and different things.
Yeah.
Somebody said, what about golf? And I'm like, those guys still play till they're die, to their dead. And so it's kind of, you got to find sports where there's a finite finish, right? Olympic athlete, somebody in a different sport, even bowling, right? I mean, I don't know. When do they retire from bowling? I don't know, from professional bowling. So
we good ones in Detroit too. Bob Strampy comes to mind.
Absolutely.
Eddie Levansky. You go back in the year, bowling in Detroit has been phenomenal. But Scott, you do bring up a good point, because you remember Howdy Holmes? Howdy Holmes was a NASCAR driver, and Howdy Holmes got into the Jiffy company, I believe, near Ann Arbor, isn't it, Kurt and Scott?
The Jiffy, the mix, the different mixes that they have. Yeah.
Howdy Holmes got his second career as an executive with Jiffy, and he was a great guy to talk to. I interviewed him many, many years ago at MIS, and that jogged my mind when you mentioned about Elway, that Howdy Holmes had a great story to tell too as well. So, and another thing I thought about, Kurt and Scott, is the Tigers have a penchant now for bringing back their guys, obviously. And they got great talent, obviously, with Alan Trammell, Kurt Gibson. You had the late Al Kaline, Willie Horton. They make them executive assistants to General Manager Al Avila. What are your thoughts on that, Kurt?
You see, you're seeing that more and more. I mean, the Red Wings are doing it as well, right? You see some of their players that are either over in Grand Rapids with the teams and, the farm systems. But part of it is, I don't know if it's a PR thing as much as taking care of their own. I mean, you take care of your own, so to speak. And it's neat to see teams that do that. Or is it part of a PR move to say, oh boy, we're not selling a lot of tickets, so let's bring this person in. Maybe it'll help us sell more tickets or whatever. And so, I always like to have teams have I love it when teams have a alumni type strength. In other words, there's alumni. That's probably one of the biggest criticisms I've heard, especially for the Lions, just to be very frank. The players that I know that have played for the Lions and have played with other organizations, such as the Packers or somebody that's won a Super Bowl, they say, like one of the guys, he played for the Packers. He's like, they still call me back every summer. They're sending me a check to come, play golf with for this outing or something like that. They said the Lions rarely do that. There's not a strong alumni where there's a lot of pride, and boy, I played here. And I think that's the biggest thing, is if they can develop that, and maybe that's what they're trying to do with those guys, with K-Line when he was here. I mean, K-Line was just, he was an icon throughout the whole league, not just in Detroit.
Yeah.
And so,
well, I think you're right. Mike Ilitch was big on that. You're right, because the Red Wings have a strong alumni association.
Mm-hmm.
They always have. Tigers seem to have a pretty good one, although there have been some, problems with like the relationship of Denny McClain and Mickey Lolich and things like that have gone on. But you're right. I think that the Pistons probably is not as strong. Like you mentioned, the Lions is not as strong, but I know the Wings and the Tigers have tried to do a good job with that.
Well, when you talk about athletes who have really struggled after the fact, I think one of the things that really, ironically, when we talk about election night, Curt Schilling is an individual, for me, where some of his controversial comments have probably kept him, I think, out of the hall. Very good postseason pitcher. And yet he had some investments that went badly with that 38, with that company that he's talking about. And yet he's just another example of what you're trying to represent in terms of, when you talk about your show, Curt. I mean, from one Curt to another is probably the C, of course. But.
Well, it's, the great thing about this show concept is there's never, I shouldn't say never, but I can't imagine ever running out of former athletes to interview for this, that fit the category that we want. I mean, there's always going to be former athletes, regardless of the sport, not just the main four, but like you said, NASCAR drivers or, different athletes from different genres. I think the biggest thing is identifying. One is, we're at the point now where we're looking at only Hall of Fame or All-Star status, right, or world champion status. And then they have to have recreated their success afterwards. That's the criteria. And so, that does, I don't want to say limit, but at least narrows the focus of what kind of athletes we have on the show. There's always going to be those stories of crash and burn, and those are the ones you're going to hear about most in the news. We want to illustrate stories that are athletes that you probably didn't know about. I'll give you a great example of that. One of the guys you interviewed in season 3 was Charlie Batch, or I'm sorry, season 4 was Charlie Batch. And just, for those of you that may not know Charlie Batch's story, Charlie Batch grew up in Pittsburgh, came to Eastern Michigan University to play football only because that was the only school that offered him a scholarship. And so he had no idea where Eastern Michigan, where Ypsilanti, Michigan was, but it was like, hey, they offered me a scholarship, I'm going to go there, right? So Charlie came from Pittsburgh to Eastern Michigan University. His junior year in college at Eastern Michigan, he got a phone call from his mother. And his mother said, hey, I need you to come home. And he's like, well, Mom, I'm right in the middle of schooling and football workouts and everything. She's like, nope, I need you to come home now. And he's like, well, Mom, what's going on? I'm right in the middle of football and all the, workouts. She goes, well, your 17-year-old sister was just murdered by a gangbang-related shooting, drive-by shooting. So you need to come home. We need to bury her. And so Charlie Batch had told his coaches, hey, I don't know if I'm coming back. I got to go home, help my mom, help bury my sister. Coaches were like, do whatever you got to do. If you don't come back, it's, do whatever you need to do. So Charlie went back, buried his 17-year-old sister. His mother said, you know what, you need to go back and finish your degree, finish your football, take care of your own business at this point. So he came back to Eastern Michigan, broke every record as a quarterback. And those of us that know, went on to play for the Detroit Lions, then went on to the Pittsburgh Steelers, won 2 Super Bowl championships as a quarterback there, backup quarterback most of the time. But now Charlie has a foundation where he has sports and educational facility for inner city kids in Pittsburgh, with the idea that if he can save one kid off the street in honor of his sister, it's worth every penny. And so that's what he's doing now. He's got this foundation. It's called Best the Batch. They have inner city sports. They have, tutoring programs and things for inner city kids. And that's what he's doing, as well as the broadcasting he does for the Steelers games. But those are the kind of stories that we want to get out that most people don't hear about.
Sure. And he's represented by a wonderful lady, Risa Baleam.
Yeah. I think
really? Hang on, George, what's the connection there? Help me understand that.
Oh, Risa used to be public relations for the Detroit Lions. And I know Risa has been, representing and being with Charlie all through the years. And what a wonderful lady she is. She got her own PR company out of Ann Arbor. Scott and I, years and years.
Yeah. See, I think the one thing where you're at now, Curt, is you're at a point where you can be more selective. But at one point, I think when you were building your brand, then it was good to be able to hear it from a lot of different angles. Now, I do know that John Sally, we all know that he loved to go out there and be the ultimate entertainer, whether it was in New York and LA. But as I understand it, I think he relocated back to the Detroit area, if I understand. I don't know for sure, but I've heard that. And Lomas Brown is another guy who won Super Bowls elsewhere. Then again, don't they all? And now he's he's broadcasting for the Lions. But when you talk about these types of players, the elite Hall of Famers versus what you had before, don't you find that there is a pretty interesting blend to go both ways? Because I imagine your testimonials, if you're going to come up with book material, television material, or whatnot, that you've got to have a little bit of everything out there.
Yeah, well, one of the guys we interviewed in season 5 had more than everything out there, and that was Darren McCarty. So we interviewed Darren for the show. And as I mentioned, we talk about the glory days. Darren won 4 Stanley Cups. 4 Stanley Cups. So he won 4 Stanley Cups, and he was not immune to that transition. He had a horrific transition, very public transition, right? Cocaine addiction, gambling addiction, bankruptcy. Right. Darren very flatly said, I was this close to death, right? The next step for me would have been death, that I was just at that point in my life. And the turnaround happened, and this is why we had Darren on the show, was to talk about his turnaround and how he recreated the success of his sobriety. Was that he said, I had to move away. He moved down to Florida, he remarried, and then he started writing his book. And he said that was very therapeutic to have his story told and written like that. He says between his new wife and his book, he says that just really changed his whole life, and now he's back in town. And so he's really excited about how he got through those demons, so to speak. And, something I want to back up and talk about, you mentioned about I'm at a point now with the show that we can be a little more picky and choosy. It's funny because when I first started out, I'd have a couple cell phone numbers, so I'd call the guys. Rick Leach was the very first guy I called. I had Rick's cell phone number, and I had known Rick because I had coached his sons at North Farmington High School varsity basketball. And so I knew Rick and was able to say, hey, Rick, here's the concept. I want to do this. So he's the first guy I called. As I started going down that rabbit hole and interviewing more and more guys, next thing I know, these guys are like sending me their golf list with their cell phone numbers. And so my list continued to grow over, and once they realized what I was doing and had experience with it, now they're like, hey, here's so-and-so. Why don't you call this guy? Here's their so. And so really getting athletes is the easiest part of this. And if I don't have their cell phone number, I know somebody that does have their cell phone number. And so that's been a neat thing. I felt that was worthy bringing up. But I think the biggest thing is, as I mentioned, you look at guys that have gone through those horrific transitions like Darren McCarty, like we talked about. What's neat to see is that, it could have stayed there. We could have talked about Darren's death. We could have talked about, boy, it's sad. He went from 4 Stanley Cups and now he's an invalid, or, just has no brain anymore. He's, in a coma or something like that. Yeah. But he's made it through, and he talks very openly of how he's done it, how he continues to do it, and, where that journey's taken him to this day.
Well, I even find as I'm trying to build a brain here, you try to find out what works, what doesn't work. And I tell individuals, for those that don't have anything, you work through LinkedIn. I don't think people realize how powerful LinkedIn really is. But I've learned what a valuable tool it is. I know another guy in Metro Detroit, obviously relocated recently back to Chicago, Chris Chelios, has done well for himself. Do you find that a lot of these guys end up going in the restaurant business, knowing full well that, I know Jacques Demers had his name attached to one on Embassy Suites, I think right up the road from me in Southfield. But the restaurant business, I would think, would be a very common place. You think about Harry Carey having one out in Chicago, Mike Ditka, and I know there's a lot of other examples, but I would think the restaurant business. But Chris Chelios is a prime example of what you can do when you're able to make such a move like that.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is they have a little capital in their pocket, right? Some of these guys, they have some money in their pocket, so they're able to venture off into things. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, right? You talk about Derek Coleman. He's a first round or number 1 draft pick in the NBA. And, had his career, and you can talk about his career one way or another. Some people say he never lived up to his potential. Other people say that, he just didn't have the chance. But he was really big when he got done playing about giving back in Detroit, especially where he grew up. He wanted to really get back to that area. And Derek got a lot into business, a lot into, developments down there. But I think one of the problems that Derek had was that, unfortunately, he didn't always have that knowledge as an entrepreneur, and I think his heart was right, but I think the business sense, some of those places that he developed, maybe they weren't in the right area, or maybe it wasn't developed right, or he had some struggles as a result. And here he had lots of capital to build on. Rick Leach talked about it as well. Rick, I alluded to earlier, Rick talked about going into business. He said, I had money in my pocket, so I was, part of a partnership of a business. And he said some years into it, he started realizing that his partner was robbing him blind. And he says he didn't realize that until he tapped into one of his U of M friends, and who was a business-minded. And he said, hey, can you take a look at my books here? I'm not sure what's going on. The guy looked at it and said, Rick, I hate to tell you this. And so he ended up having to sue his own partner. He said it was a very horrific situation, very stressful on the family. He says we won, but he says having to go through that was very difficult. And so my point is, a lot of these athletes have some capital to come out and start things such as a restaurant or, businesses that would require a little capital to get going, but it doesn't guarantee success. I mean, they have to surround themselves with people that have better knowledge. I'm a living example of that. I'll give you a great example. I have an elementary education degree. That's my undergrad. I have a master's in counseling. That's my master's degree. I don't have any education in TV, zero whatsoever. Right. And so, part of my journey has been learning, but also more importantly, surrounding myself with people that are much smarter than I am in this area, to the point that I'm now executive producing 6 different TV and documentary shows. And so, it's not necessarily that I know that, it's that I surround myself with people that know it better than I do.
Well, you talked about Derek Coleman. Here's the most interesting irony, and a day full of them. When my parents decided to relocate to South Florida, and I joined them down here, Derek Coleman bought my parents' place on White Lake, just so you know that. It was right.
Oh, you're kidding me.
No, I'm not. I mean,
that was a pretty big place.
Yeah, it was. My parents decided to downsize is what they did. And like every other person on the planet, they got tired of the snow and all that. And they decided to just sell it. Derek bought it. They ended up moving into a beautiful condominium down in southern Florida. But yeah, he ended up buying it, and
no kidding.
Yeah. Well, you talk about the interesting irony that my brother, you go to his restaurant, the Black Rock Bar and Grill, out in Heartland. I'll give him a little plug. I have no problem with it tonight anyways. But my Derek Coleman would end up going ahead and buying my parents' place because they chose to live in southern Florida and had enough of Metro Detroit. Like a lot of people, they get tired of the snow and the ice and the potholes and so forth.
Yeah, Derek's not there anymore, but yeah, I've heard, I've not been in that house, but I heard it was a beautiful house on White Lake there. So.
Yeah, it was. I went there every now and then. I mean, I didn't go there a lot because I lived those years in Farmington Hills. And for me, Farmington Hills was more centrally located for what my business interests are. But I went there every now and then. It was definitely a pretty big place for a couple of people, that's for sure. It was by the pool, but that was
it was a beautiful place. I saw it one time. I remember, Scott, and but I wanted to piggyback on something you mentioned earlier, Kurt, and that's the philanthropy part. The things that people give back. Ted Lindsay giving back to the cause of autism, and Jim Price, Jack's Place for autism. Yes. You talk about guys like that, and I mean, I know that, okay, they might make a little bit on the side, perhaps, off these organizations, but talk about those kind of guys, those athletes that go out of their way and trying to help other people and help causes like that. I think that's wonderful, don't you?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's a lot of it depends on their foundation, right? A lot of these guys, they were raised that way. Going back to my foundation again, I was raised by 2 parents. One was a teacher at a small private school, so very humble. And my father was the director of social services for the county. So 2 very giving careers, right? They both gave as a teacher, director of social services. And so, part of my DNA is giving back as well. And so a lot of it depends on their appreciation of what they had. I mean, most of the guys that I talk to, they understand that, hey, I've been given this opportunity, whether it be financially or prestige. And I think it's an important part to understand that part of giving back, or part of having this opportunity is giving back as well. And some do it quietly. Some you may not ever know about, like this Charlie Batch thing. Many people in this area may not even have a clue that he's doing that. That's his give back, is helping inner city kids in Pittsburgh. And some people may not know. I mean, one of my give backs from the TV show is I've been delivering birthday cakes to inner city kids, homeless kids. worked out a deal with the Detroit Rescue Mission that we have a location down there where there's homeless kids, and anywhere from 3 to 13 birthday cakes every month I'm taking down there to deliver. And to see these kids light up on their birthday, that they get a birthday cake, and it's not just for them, they get to share with the other kids there, and they get all excited as well. And so I just believe giving back is an important part of when you receive something. What's the saying? The more you have, the more you have to, or the more you are given, the more you're expected. And so, I take that very seriously. So the more I receive, the more I'm expected to give back, in my opinion.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, I really think that you've got a great pulse on what's going on out there. I think of restaurants. I think of Billy Sims, Herman Moore, guys like that have tried restaurants, and some to some success and some to not. It is kind of a risky business in some degree, but like you said, they have some capital invested in it. It's one of those things where, especially now with COVID going on, it's unbelievable how many restaurants have closed in this area, all over the country for that matter. It's risky business now, I guess you'd say.
Yes.
Yeah.
Kurt, do you find yourself working with a lot of national athletes? I know that a lot of your focus is on the Metro Detroit area, but let's not kid yourself. When you start going ahead and appearing on national podcasts, I don't even mind mentioning one that you went on, because I had her on here on my broadcast. Lorinda Phillips works out in the Southern California area. But, for an individual like yourself who not only prides yourself around doing what you do locally, but nationally, I imagine that if your Rolodex is as high as I think it is, and you need to transfer it to the iCloud, because that's what the technology term is anyways, what kind of a percentage do you do when it comes to on the national side? Because, you probably got more material from here all the way until the year 3000 at the rate you keep building this.
Well, it's one of the great things, we alluded to the pandemic. One of the great things about this pandemic, well, I guess when we start with one of the bad things, one of the things I do is speak. Also, I do keynote speaking. And in 2019, I did over 140 keynote presentations. And in 2020, I've done 5, right? And so that's been a radical change for me as far as going from that many keynotes to 5. The good news is that my Rolodex, as you say, has exponentially expounded. I mean, it's unbelievable. The connections, a lot of them are through LinkedIn, as you mentioned, have really expounded. I mean, I'll give you a great example. One of the guys I connected with this past spring was one of the producers of the movie Rudy. Remember the movie Rudy on Notre Dame there? Well, this guy's in Orange County, and Alan Mintz and I connected, and we, communicate probably at least once every 2-3 weeks just about projects and things that he's doing. And, it's been a great connection, and that connection's led to many, many more connections and to many more projects. I mean, one of the projects I picked up as a result of Alan, through a connection that he had, is a documentary on a Negro Baseball League. So that's one of the documentaries I'm working on right now, is a documentary about the Negro Baseball League. And so, with the show From Glory Days, what started it all, with the book and the TV show, we're actually looking at going national. We started shopping it before the pandemic. We actually had signed on Doug Flutie to be the new host. And George, I don't think you knew that. I wasn't going to host the show anymore. I was just going to stay on as creator and executive producer, and Doug Flutie was going to be the new host. Well, then all of a sudden the pandemic hit and everything shut down, and even a lot of the agencies in LA now are still on furlough. So it's been very difficult to continue that progress. But, our goal is to get on a national stage. And I think the concept is worthy of it. It's just a matter of getting the right talent, getting the right production levels to that point where we can be on a national stage that somebody be interested in. So, all these projects, another project I'm doing right now is called The Saint. It's about the St. Cecilia Gym and about the history of the St. Cecilia Gym, which is a great story, in my opinion. You guys probably are familiar with it, but in 1967, when the riots hit Detroit, Sam Washington Sr. went across the street to St. Cecilia Gym and talked to the priest and said, "Hey, can we open a gym for my boys here to come in and play a little basketball?" Well, that's how it all started. And from 1967 to 1989, it became a mecca for basketball talent. I equate St. Cecilia Gym to like the Motown of basketball, right? I mean, it just had that big of an impact. Yeah. And what's neat in the story that we're really expounding on isn't just the NBA players that played there that proved themselves, the Magic Johnson, the Jalen Rose, all these All-Americans that came out of there, and NBA Hall of Famers even. But it's the guys that maybe didn't make it in the NBA that played through there as well. Judge Greg Mathis is a great example of that, because of his opportunity to play there. There's an engineer that worked on the space shuttle. There's other attorneys and teachers and people that had success. And so that's part of the documentary story that we're telling as well. And so that's an exciting project as well.
Do you find that during the pandemic that a lot of your productions, like all of us, have had to depend on the Zoom format, or whether it's StreamYard or any kind of streaming? Because nowadays, let's face it, not everybody can fly into Kurt David's studio, since traveling has never been as different as it is now.
Well, I've been on more Zoom calls or meetings in the last 7 months than I have in 7 years put together. No doubt. Most of our production absolutely stopped. The in-studio for us, for one of the shows that I do, it's a mental health show. It's called Mind Matters with Dr. Michelle. It's a local mental health show here in Detroit. We just started rolling tape again for the first time about 4 weeks ago. And so it's been, and I've done some virtual interviews over the summer from Glory Days show, but it's just not the same. It's just, there's nothing replaces an in-person interview or in-person production, and we understand that. The good news is, there are, as long as we can keep production levels to under 10 people in the studio, it seems like that seems to be working right now. So we're slowly getting there. The biggest thing is the funding. I mean, all these projects can't happen without the funding, and a lot of people just hung onto their purse strings trying to figure out what's going to happen before they had their ad spends or sponsor spends. So that's been the biggest challenge. But we're starting to see that change a little bit right now too.
Yeah, I got to tell you, I have been inundated with a lot of Zoom things, and my wife and I did a show on technology and how much I hate it, but you have no choice but to learn it, or you're going to miss the bus. And I can appreciate a lot of the things that you're telling me, because, I remain very involved in Detroit with Detroit Sports Media, the National Sports Media Association. So even though I haven't been able to get to their events this year because they shut them down, and an area that I have a vested interest in that I'm going to build on down the road is Southern California sports broadcast, and I want to get that West Coast market. And you can only imagine, as you talk about what you're doing locally, my goal is to have a West Coast presence as well as national and maintain my roots back home. And I think that, obviously it takes a lot longer because of everything that you're going through, but you do have to have a steady balance of everything. That way you're able to relate to all genres. And I tell you what, I never knew what the word Zoom was until I exercised it on the interstate. And usually when you exercise it on the interstate, it could get expensive unless you break the 11th commandment, thou shalt not get caught. And if you didn't know what the 11th one is, now you learn it. And if you want to know what the 12th one is, thou shalt not overspend. And Moses didn't come up with that, but we're not getting political here. We're just talking, having fun on this broadcast. So
That's right. Hey, another name for you, guys, Denny McClain. You talk about a guy who's had so many ups and downs in his career, both personal, on and off the field. Kurt, did you ever talk to Denny McClain?
Denny was on in season 3, and to be honest, I really didn't want to have him on the show. To be very frank, I have a lot of respect. Let me say it this way: I have a lot of respect for Denny as a baseball player. There's no question. I mean, for him to win the amount of games, nobody's going to break that record, the single season record, right? Because there's pitch count now. Everybody's worried about how many pitches, and I don't think anybody's ever going to break that record. So I have a lot of respect for him as an athlete and as a baseball player. However, I know a lot of information. In fact, the guy this is inside information, but it's public knowledge, so I guess I can share it very openly. Denny bought Pete Packing, and when Denny bought Pete Packing, he had bought a insurance policy with a guy that I know. And the guy sold the insurance policy to Denny for Pete Packing for the employees. Well, somewhere down the line, all of a sudden the employees are calling this insurance company saying, hey, how come this isn't being covered? And how come this isn't being covered? And, they were like, no, that's part of your policy. It's covered. So finally, this owner of this insurance company called and tried to get a hold of Denny, and he wouldn't take his calls. And finally got a hold of Denny live and says, hey, this is so-and-so from the insurance company. He's like, I'm getting all these complaints from your employees about the coverage not covering. And Denny says, well, we changed policies. We changed, insurance carriers. Oh, okay. Who'd you change it to? Well, he gave him a name. So this guy, the owner of the insurance company, called this other company and says, hey, did you sell a policy to Pete Packing? He's like, no. Well, that's what Denny got. There was a second arrest was for skimming those premiums. skimming the insurance premiums. And the guy that I know that sold the policy to him had to testify in front of a grand jury, and that's what Denny spent some time in prison for. And and so I hear those stories, and it just the only reason why we had him on in season 3 was that he almost died. He lost 180 pounds because he had all these health issues, and so we were going to talk about his health and how he recreated his success with his health and kind of spin it that way. But probably one of the most disappointing parts of that interview was that at the end of the interview, I was point blank with him. I said, Denny, some people hear the name Denny McLain and they revere it for what you've accomplished as a baseball player. Other people hear the name Denny McLain and they're despised by it. Do you have any regrets? And I thought, okay, here it is. I'm throwing him a softball, right? I thought, if he comes out and says, hey, I love Detroit. I screwed up, but I love Detroit. I thought, oh, this is perfect, right? So I threw him that softball. I said, do you have any regrets? He looked at me. He says, the only regret I have in my life is that my daughter was killed by a drunk driver. That's the only regret that I have in my life. And I thought, that's too bad. Here he had a chance to really come out, come clean, and own up to what he had done. And so, great athlete. Will probably never have that record broke. As a person, again, people are still, especially those impacted by his decisions. And, so you brought it up and now you got it.
I've got a couple questions. I don't know if we've covered them. I want to make sure we do get around to those. Okay, Kurt. First of all, what were some of the common concerns that athletes have?
Before, during, or after sports?
Well, you tell me, George. Obviously,
Take it afterwards. Like you said earlier, you alluded to some of the money and the financial strains on them, but are there some other common concerns that these athletes have?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, money is the most obvious because that's what people talk about. And it's like, oh, they make all this money. And, depending on the era, Jim Northrup, I think he said the peak of his contract was $35,000, right? And so, it was a different era, obviously. But you guys now are making that per minute, literally, right? They're making that a minute during a game. And so, it's a different era. So it depends on the era. So money's talked about a lot in the transition from money. But I'm finding probably one of the biggest things, which is a sleeper for most athletes, is their identity. And what I mean by that is that the athletes that have an understanding that this is just what I do, it's not who I am, have a smoother transition from those athletes that, hey, this is what I do and this is who I am, right? I'm a pro hockey player and that's all I am. Or I'm a pro baseball player and that's all who I am.
Right.
Those are the athletes that really struggle. So the athletes that understand that, this is what I play professional basketball, but that's not who I am. That helps with that transition, helps them separate as a result. Dan Petrie had alluded to Sparky Anderson a lot during my interview with Dan. And he had said that Sparky, throughout his career when he was playing for the Tigers, had often reminded the guys that, hey, this is only temporary. Enjoy it while you can. It's going to be over at some point. And he said that was always the seed that was being planted by Sparky, that, hey, we want to do the best we can, but understand it's going to be over at some point. And so, Petrie is very grateful that those seeds were being planted. It was still a rude reality, right, when they got out, but at least they had that foundation to say, oh, yeah, this is what he was talking about. So,
yeah.
So with that said, okay, do you find that a lot of athletes fall into some deep depression and some of them can become suicidal? Because I had Eric Hipple on a broadcast earlier in the year, and I've come across Eric Kramer, on the road. And a lot of athletes realize, because we talk about the success, the good, the bad, and the ugly could end up being resulted. Some guys, whether they lose everything they have, because remember, Joe Murphy is another guy who's homeless up in, he's homeless. I know he's one sort of guy. There's a lot of them. But you have depression, suicide, and a lot of things like that. And I know Eric Kramer considered it. So why don't we talk about medical issues with what we're based on?
Yeah, well, you're asking the right guy because, as a former professional athlete who now has a degree in counseling, certainly mental health is an important part of what I view, or my lens that I view things through. And I think that's part of what makes me enamored by this topic, is it's not just the fact that I played professionally, but I have this lens as a counselor now to look at this as well.
Right.
And I think, I always talk about balance, right? I really believe that in order to get to the highest level as a professional athlete, you're very unbalanced. You're unbalanced, right? You have to be, right? You're so hyper-focused on one thing, and that's one thing only, and that's being the best you can. And as a result, it's really an imbalance of your mental being. And as an example, I mean, many athletes have OCD, right? Many athletes suffer with depression because of the peaks and valleys, especially after playing pro sports, especially if your identity is that pro sport.
Yes.
A lot of them deal with mood swings. The TBI is becoming more and more prevalent now. About the traumatic brain injuries and how it changes personalities. I mean, I've seen athletes' personalities change as a result of that, and we're seeing more and more court cases being played out. One of the guys I interviewed this summer virtually was George Visper, and George played with the 49ers, won a Super Bowl with the 49ers. He was the first guy to win a lawsuit against the NFL for TBIs. And so George talked about his journey and how difficult his life is now as a result because of these brain injuries that he's had, and finally got a payout from the NFL for it. And he was the first. And we also had another guy on that won 2 Stanley Cups with the Blackhawks, who is now right in the middle of a lawsuit with the NHL for the very same reason. And so, it's very real for these guys. It's a mental health issue. You mentioned Eric Hipple. Eric had a very, very sobering and tragic transition when his son took his own life. And, but now Eric's taken a tragedy and turned it into a triumph, which is great. He travels all over the world, speaks and advocates about depression, which is great. You have a former NFL quarterback advocating about that. And so, it's something I don't take lightly at all, but it's a very real thing that all of us have to address. I mean, we all deal with different type of challenges in our lives, but as a pro athlete, you got to be balanced, and that's part of it, is finding that balance, especially after sports.
Yeah, I had a guy on our broadcast many times as a football analyst. I don't know if the name rings a bell to you, Michael Keller, former Michigan Wolverine, who's been. I actually met him in person about 1.5 years ago, and spent time with his cabin, and he's part of that. And there's a lot of examples of that. But Mike told me, he believes he does have the onset of CTE, and but that's it. He's just one of many. So let's piggyback off of that question, Kurt. Can you tell us any athletes that had special stories or special concerns that stand out?
Oh boy, one of the most impactful interviews I did was a guy out of Ottawa, Canada. Doug Smith was a number 2 draft pick in the NHL. Not the number 1. He was a number 2 draft pick by the LA Kings. And so he came out of Ottawa, Canada, number 2 pick in the NHL, went from little Ottawa, Canada to LA. Imagine that. 19-year-old kid. Yeah. He said it was like a free fall, right? He went from being in Ottawa, Canada to 19 years old, money in his pocket, Porsche, condo on the beach. He said it was like a free fall. Well, moving forward from that moment, at 28 years old, during a hockey game, he went headfirst into the boards and went from being a professional athlete to being instantly a quadriplegic. Snapped his neck, nothing from the neck on down. And he talked about how, he was so despondent and just, he couldn't do anything from the neck on down. And he said, I couldn't even take my own life, right? I didn't even have any capabilities. And his wife finally recognized how despondent he was and got in his face and said, hey, listen, I can't imagine what you're experiencing or what you're feeling, but I love you. You have 2 beautiful daughters that love you. And Doug Smith talked about how that was the seminal moment to shift his attitude, right? He went from feeling sorry for himself to all of a sudden he realized, boy, you know what? I need to figure this out. And so over the course of the next 14 years, he and his wife did a lot of research, a lot of therapy, and they realized that his paralysis came not from a severed spinal cord, but from the trauma of the vertebrae that shattered around it. And so his vertebrae was still, his spinal cord was still intact, which was huge. And so over the course of 14 years, he gained mobility again. He was able to walk again. He's got some braces and, a little bit of staggering here and there, but he's now a motivational speaker and author throughout Canada. And, what an impactful story. And one of his biggest sound bites, he talked about as a professional athlete, Doug Smith talked about, as a professional athlete, my goal is to be the best in the world, right? I want to be the best in the world. He said after his accident with his neck, he said he realized that, I went from wanting to be the best in the world, I want to be the best for the world. And his whole attitude changed as a result.
So when you talk about you wanting to hit a certain type of athlete, Hall of Famers or not, do you ever run across situations, Kurt, where you have guys whose careers ended prematurely that end up doing incredible things. The guy that stands out, and I've covered the NFL, a lot of sports, but the guy who stands out in my mind is Mike Utley, and I was at that football game when he got hurt. Because even though a guy may not make it to the Hall of Fame based on his accomplishments on the field, they've been able to take a situation where their careers got cut short. Unfortunately, we know that all it takes is one injury in any sport, for that matter, to end your career. And these guys are just, to me, as inspiring as anybody else. And I know Mike Utley. I know another, George and I actually many years ago, I don't know if you knew this or not, or you will now, as we were at the game when Chuck Hughes passed away on the field back in 1971, I believe, George. And then I saw Jerry Ball
Yes.
and Reggie Brown. And unfortunately, I've seen a few of those games. But you have a lot of guys whose career has ended prematurely that have unbelievable stories as well.
Yeah, Mike Utley was one of the guys I interviewed virtually this summer, as a matter of fact. I've known Mike for years, and he and I have gone back and forth about, when's he going to be back in town? Is he traveling again? And so we've gone back and forth with him and his wife, Danny, about, okay, when's this interview going to happen? So finally, I called him up this summer, and I'm like, hey, listen, we got to do this. Whether it's virtual or whatever, we just got to get this done. So I interviewed him virtually. And the neat thing about Mike is that he has all the reason in the world to be bitter and angry. He has all the reason in the world. And he's the total opposite. He's like, you know what? I have no regrets. I don't have any regrets about playing football. It's unfortunate what happened. But, and he wants to empower other people that are in wheelchairs or have physical challenges to say, hey, you guys keep living your life, right? You keep living your life. And that's his attitude. And it's a great attitude, and I think that's the type of attitude that he wants to express to other people as well.
I used to see a lot of Lions players actually on Thanksgiving Day when I used to cover the game all the time, and that was always a unifying way to do it. And then you have other guys who are icons that had to deal with ALCS, Lou Gehrig's disease, and they're as inspiring. And I know we can go all night on this whole thing, but when we try to talk about inspiring stories, because you, as an interviewer, like I am with you tonight and him, okay, these are the types of things that we go out there and try to find out from our potential guests, don't we? So like you kidded around earlier, now you're the one who's asking the questions, and I'm the one answering them, which is a change of pace. But getting my point, that when you run across these types of, whether they're diseases that are such as ALCS, cancer stories or whatever, it's still inspiring. And I know that your responsibility is to impact. Would you say that that's the biggest part of what you do, Kurt, is the word impact? 5 exclamation points or 500 of them?
I guess one of my taglines for the show is we look to inspire others through the stories of highly successful people that live a life of significance. And so, you can wrap that up into one word as impact, but basically we want to inspire others through the stories of highly successful people that are living a life of significance. And I think that's what it describes, is that impact, so to speak. Yes.
So I actually hope for those individuals that are watching this broadcast or listening to it that the word impact and inspiring will be the two things that I believe. In fact, I know that you should get out of this broadcast. This is Scott Morgan, Motor City Madmouth. Glad to have George Eichorn and Kurt Davis on the broadcast. And it's a great opportunity to talk about athletes, not only inside the lines, but outside the lines. And, I think that that's the one topic that doesn't get discussed enough for sure. George, anything you want to add to this?
No, it's been a great program, Kurt. You've been a great guest. Thank you so much for coming on board this week in our special edition of the Sports Exchange. You have wealth of knowledge, and Kurt, I've always admired your work. It's been great having you as a fellow member of Detroit Sports Media Association along with Scott. And, of course, our president, Jennifer Hammond, and we're all very proud members of that organization. So it's been great having you on the show tonight, Kurt.
So it's my pleasure. Thanks again. Keep up the great work, fellas.
All right. So, Kurt, with that said, now that we're closing in on the end of the broadcast, I want everybody to know how they get a hold of you. George will follow suit, and I will do the same to wrap it up. So,
yeah, probably the best way. Yeah, best way is my website, kurtdavid.com, KURTDAVID. kurtdavid.com. There's a contact page, and you can reach out through there.
Okay, George.
Well, yeah, I've got my book out there, Detroit Sports Broadcasters on the Air, of course, and There's a link to purchase my book for about $20 or so. You could get a great copy of that book from Arcadia Press. I've got great stories and photos in there from Al Kaline, Ernie Harwell, George Kell, Bud Lynch, Bruce Martin, Ray Lane, Jim Brandstatter, Ken Daniels, and also Scott Morganroth. Scott, there's a whole page. Somehow you are photographed with two legends, Muhammad Ali and Jimmy Connors.
Not too bad, I guess. All right. So with that said, in turn, if you want to follow us here, you can follow us and on Twitter at Tribune South. That's at Tribune South. Our Facebook and Instagram, South Florida Tribune. You can follow us there. YouTube channel, South Florida Tribune. All you need to do is subscribe, and I'll give you 6 good reasons why you should subscribe. We have 6 shows currently going on now. The Sports Exchange, No Limits, which is a 108 Stitches Baseball Talk, Real and the Rare, Fantasy Football, South Florida Tribune. We might like to make sure that there's a good variety of broadcasts out there. So you can follow us and subscribe on the South Florida Tribune. You get an opportunity to watch them there. Now, also, our website is www.southfloridatribune.com. What we have there is a Motor City Monitor where we do focus on a lot of the Motor City stuff. Being from the area, why not focus on my hometown? We also have columns, affiliates columns from our media distribution partners. We have our contributors' writings where we have columnists there. And more importantly, you can also go to the southfloridatribune.com to find each and every one of our broadcasts there as well. You can email us at southfloridatribune@gmail.com. Any suggestions, comments about the show's content, feel free to contact us. We'll get back to you. And, of course, you can connect with me on LinkedIn, Scott Morganroth. If you want to go ahead and listen to the audio version of the broadcast, Apple Podcasts, Spreaker, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. So there's a lot of different ways to hear it, watch it. And once again, if I talk too fast, and again, I've been told I do it anyways, Apple Podcasts, Spreaker, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. So I should point out to everybody that Election Day is tomorrow. We encourage you to go out there and vote. Okay, everybody has an opportunity to impact this election. I should also point out the COVID situation, folks. Social distance, mask up, use common sense, common courtesy, do whatever you've got to do. These numbers are not to be taken lightly. And obviously, the way COVID-19 has impacted our society, don't take it lightly, whether you have a vaccine or not. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to play it safe and stay at home when necessary. So, any closing thoughts, Kurt?
I'm honored to be on the show. Appreciate it. You guys keep up the great work.
Thanks.
Thank you. You too.
And I look forward to seeing you when we I get back up to Detroit, Kurt. But meanwhile, it's been a pleasure. So on behalf of Kurt, David, George Eichorn, my name is Scott Morganroth, the Motor City Man Mouth. Thank you for joining us on this edition of the Sports Exchange. Good night, everybody. And George and Eichorn and I will be ready for another edition of the Sports Exchange. Good night, everybody.
Good night.